Life has a funny way of surprising you. That's what Alex kept thinking as he stood at the altar, watching his soon-to-be wife walk down the aisle. She was a large woman, weighing 500 pounds, and the wooden floor creaked under each step she took. The wedding guests whispered among themselves, their eyes fixed on the bride with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Alex never imagined this would be his wedding day. Growing up in the small town of Pine Grove, everyone knew about Linda, the woman who had turned bullying into an art form. She wasn't just physically intimidating. Her words could cut deeper than any knife. The local grocery store would practically clear out when she arrived, and people would cross the street to avoid walking past her. "You're making a huge mistake," his best friend had warned him the night before the wedding. "She made my kid sister cry just last week for wearing braces." Who does that? But Alex's hands were tied. His family's small business was struggling, and Linda's father owned the bank that held their loans. The marriage wasn't exactly arranged, but the pressure from both families made it clear there was only one acceptable choice. The ceremony itself was a quiet affair. Most people had politely declined their invitations, citing prior commitments. The few who did attend sat stiffly in their chairs, as if afraid any sudden movement might draw Linda's attention. Alex's mother dabbed at her eyes throughout the ceremony, and anyone who didn't know better might have thought they were tears of joy. Their first few weeks of marriage were exactly what Alex had expected. Linda dominated every aspect of their lives together. She decided what they would eat, always large portions, what they would watch, nothing that featured slim actresses, and who they could spend time with, almost nobody. The house felt like a prison, with Linda as both warden and fellow inmate. One particular incident stood out. Alex had invited his co-worker over for dinner, hoping to maintain at least one friendship. Linda spent the entire evening making snide comments about the man's receding hairline and his cheap watch. The co-worker left before dessert, and Alex never received another invitation to office gatherings after that. The neighbors quickly learned to avoid their house. The previously friendly woman next door stopped offering her usual morning waves after Linda loudly commented on her pathetic attempt at gardening. The elderly couple across the street now hurried inside whenever they saw Linda on the porch. Even the local delivery drivers seemed to approach their door with caution, probably having heard stories from their colleagues. At night, Alex would lie awake, listening to Linda's heavy breathing in the darkness. Sometimes he thought he heard other sounds too, muffled sobs or quiet sniffling. But every morning, Linda would be back to her usual self, her sharp tongue and harsh demeanor firmly in place, like armor she never took off. His family gradually stopped visiting. His sister, who used to drop by every Sunday for coffee, now only called occasionally, her voice careful and measured as if afraid Linda might be listening. His mother's usual care packages stopped arriving, and his father's invitations to weekend fishing trips dwindled to nothing. Alex found himself becoming invisible in his own home. He learned to move quietly, to take up less space, to become background noise in Linda's ongoing performance of dominance and control. He watched as his world grew smaller and smaller, limited to the spaces Linda deemed acceptable, populated only by those brave or unfortunate enough to remain in their orbit. Yet sometimes, in rare quiet moments, Alex caught glimpses of something else in Linda's eyes, a flicker of uncertainty, a flash of what might have been fear. These moments were brief, like sunshine breaking through storm clouds, but they made him wonder what lay beneath her hostile exterior. What had shaped her into the person she'd become? What stories lay hidden behind her walls of anger and aggression? But such thoughts were dangerous. They led to hope, and hope was a luxury Alex couldn't afford in his new life. So he did what he'd learned to do best. He kept his head down, his thoughts to himself, and waited for each day to pass into the next, wondering if this was all his life would ever be. Living with Linda was like walking on eggshells that had been scattered across a minefield. Every morning, Alex would wake up wondering what might set her off that day. The smallest things could trigger an outburst: a misplaced coffee mug, the wrong brand of cereal, or even the way the morning paper was folded. Their small two-story house, which should have felt like a home, had transformed into something more like a fortress. Linda had rules about everything. The curtains had to stay closed because she didn't want nosy neighbors peeking in. The thermostat was always set high because she claimed to be cold, leaving Alex constantly wiping sweat from his forehead. Even the furniture arrangement wasn't spared from her control. Everything had to be positioned exactly as she wanted it. The kitchen became a particular source of tension. Linda insisted on doing all the grocery shopping herself, returning with cartloads of her preferred snacks and comfort foods. The pantry groaned under the weight of family-sized packages, and the refrigerator was always stuffed to bursting. When Alex once suggested buying some healthier options, she didn't speak to him for 3 days straight. Their dining room table, a beautiful oak piece that had been in Alex's family for generations, now bore the scars of Linda's anger. There were scratch marks from where she'd dragged her plate too roughly, and a deep gouge from the time she'd slammed down a serving dish because Alex's mother had dared to call during dinner time. The worst part wasn't the physical changes to their living space, it was watching his social life crumble away like dry leaves in autumn. His friend Tom, who he'd known since grade school, stopped coming by after Linda mocked his recent job loss. The weekly game nights he used to host became a distant memory. Even his cousin Beth, who was known for her thick skin and patient nature, couldn't handle Linda's constant criticism of her cheap clothing and boring job as a librarian. At work, Alex began eating lunch alone at his desk. His coworkers had learned to avoid inviting him to anything after Linda had shown up at the office Christmas party and reduced the receptionist to tears with comments about her weight. An irony that seemed lost on Linda herself. The office grapevine buzzed with whispers about poor Alex and his nightmare at home, but no one dared to say anything to his face. Phone calls became Alex's only link to the outside world, and even those had to be conducted in whispers from the garage or during his lunch break at work. His mother would call, her voice tight with worry, asking if he was okay. He always said he was fine, but they both knew it was a lie. His sister would text him pictures of his nieces and nephews, children he rarely got to see because Linda had deemed family gatherings boring and a waste of time. The neighbors developed an impressive system of Linda avoidance. The retired couple next door would peek through their blinds before stepping out to get their mail. The young family across the street would hurry their children inside when they saw Linda on the porch. Even the neighborhood stray cats seemed to know better than to wander into their yard. One particular incident stood out in Alex's memory. It was during the neighborhood block party, an event they weren't invited to, but could see from their window. Linda had stood watching the festivities, making loud comments about everyone she could see. "Look at that pathetic excuse for a barbecue," she'd sneered. "And those dollar store decorations. These people have no class." But Alex had caught her reflection in the window, and for just a moment he saw something that looked like longing in her eyes. The local businesses weren't spared either. Linda had been banned from the Korma Cafe after reducing a young barista to tears over a slightly warm latte. The family-owned bakery would close early if they saw her coming. Even the usually cheerful mail carrier had developed a habit of speed-walking past their house, practically throwing their mail at the door. At night, when the house was quiet except for Linda's heavy breathing, Alex would sometimes pull out old photos from before their marriage. He'd look at pictures of himself smiling with friends, attending parties, living a normal life. These moments of reflection were always tinged with a bittersweetness, a reminder of what he'd lost and what seemed increasingly impossible to regain. Yet somehow, beneath all the chaos and control, Alex sensed there was more to Linda's story. Sometimes, in unguarded moments, he'd catch glimpses of something different, a trembling hand quickly steadied, a quivering lip quickly masked with a scowl, eyes that held more pain than anger. But these moments were as fleeting as shooting stars, gone before he could really be sure of what he'd seen. They say everyone has a breaking point. For Alex, it came during what should have been a happy family gathering, his little sister Rose's birthday celebration. After months of convincing, he had finally persuaded Linda to attend a small dinner at his parents' house. He hoped, perhaps foolishly, that this could be a turning point in their relationship with his family. The evening started tensely but manageably. His mother had prepared Linda's favorite dishes, trying her best to make her daughter-in-law feel welcome. His father kept the conversation light, discussing safe topics like the weather and the local sports team's recent victories. Rose, recently divorced and still healing, was making a genuine effort to rebuild her life, even talking about her plans to go back to school. The first hour passed without incident, though the air felt thick with unspoken words and careful movements. Everyone was trying so hard, passing dishes with deliberate care, measuring their words like ingredients in a complex recipe, laughing just a little too loudly at weak jokes. Alex could see the strain in his mother's too bright smile, the tension in his father's shoulders. Then came dessert time. Rose had baked her specialty, a homemade apple pie, something she'd been perfecting since her divorce as a way to keep her hands and mind busy during lonely evenings. She'd been proud of this particular pie, having finally mastered her grandmother's secret crust recipe. The smell of cinnamon and warm apples filled the dining room as she carefully served each slice. That's when Linda struck. "Well, I guess stress baking is one way to deal with being a failure at marriage," she said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Though from what I hear, your ex-husband ran off with someone half your size, so maybe you should stick to diet recipes instead." The room froze. The sound of a fork clattering against a plate echoed like a gunshot. Rose's face crumpled, years of carefully rebuilt confidence shattering in an instant. Tears welled up in her eyes as she pushed back from the table, knocking over her water glass in her rush to escape. The sound of her footsteps on the stairs, followed by a bedroom door slamming, felt like physical blows to Alex's heart. His mother sat there, hands trembling as she folded and refolded her napkin. His father's face had turned an alarming shade of red, his jaw clenched so tight Alex could see the muscles working. And Linda sat there, calmly eating her pie as if she hadn't just destroyed months of his sister's emotional healing in a single sentence. That was the moment something inside Alex snapped, not with a dramatic crash or bang, but with the quiet clarity of a winter morning. He looked at his wife, really looked at her, and for the first time saw past his own fear and resignation. He saw someone who was hurting so deeply that she could only function by hurting others first. The drive home was silent, but it was a different kind of silence than usual. This wasn't the fearful silence Alex had grown accustomed to, but rather the quiet of someone who had finally reached a decision. Linda must have sensed it too, because she kept glancing at him nervously, her usual confident demeanor showing cracks. Back at home, Alex sat in their living room long after Linda had gone to bed. He thought about Rose, about how hard she'd worked to rebuild herself after her divorce. He thought about his parents, growing older under the weight of watching their children suffer. He thought about all the people Linda had hurt, the friendships she'd destroyed, the joy she'd stolen. But most surprisingly, he found himself thinking about Linda herself. About the rare moments when her guard dropped, when he caught glimpses of something that looked almost like fear in her eyes. About the late-night sounds of muffled crying he pretended not to hear. About the way she would sometimes stare at old family photos when she thought no one was watching. That night, sitting in the dark of their living room, Alex realized two things. First, that he couldn't continue enabling Linda's behavior, watching passively as she hurt people he loved. And second, that perhaps Linda's bullying wasn't about power at all, maybe it was about pain, about a hurt so deep she didn't know any other way to exist in the world. As the first light of dawn began to creep through their windows, Alex made a decision. Something had to change. He couldn't save his marriage by continuing to be a silent witness to destruction. Either they would find a way to heal together, or he would have to find the courage to walk away. The thought was terrifying, but for the first time in years, it also felt like taking a full breath after being underwater for too long. 2 weeks after the disastrous family dinner, Alex came home early from work. It wasn't planned. A power outage at the office had sent everyone home shortly after lunch. He pulled into the driveway quietly, his mind still churning with thoughts about his sister Rose and how to make things right. The house looked different in the middle of the afternoon. Shadows fell at unusual angles, and the silence felt heavier somehow. Usually he could hear the TV blaring one of Linda's favorite shows, or the sound of her voice on the phone, often criticizing someone. But today there was nothing but silence. At first, he thought Linda might be napping. She often dozed off in the afternoons, especially after lunch. But as he approached the front door, he heard something that made him stop. A sound so unfamiliar in their house that it took him a moment to recognize it. Someone was crying. Not the dramatic, attention-seeking sobs that Linda sometimes used to get her way. These were different, quiet, broken sounds that reminded Alex of wounded animals. The kind of crying people do when they think no one can hear them. He opened the door as quietly as he could. The living room was dark, with only thin strips of light sneaking through the closed blinds. In the dim light, he almost missed her. Linda was sitting on the floor, her back against the couch, surrounded by what looked like old photo albums and shoeboxes full of papers. She hadn't noticed him yet. Her face was buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with each quiet sob. Scattered around her were photographs, dozens of them, spread out like fallen leaves on the carpet. Alex could make out younger versions of Linda in many of them, and two people he recognized as her parents from their wedding photos. One photo lay face up near his feet. It showed a much younger Linda, maybe 12 or 13, smiling broadly at a school event. She was already a bigger child, but her eyes sparkled with a joy he'd never seen in the woman he married. She stood between her parents, their arms wrapped protectively around her, all three of them looking happy and connected. "I miss them so much," Linda's voice suddenly cut through the silence, making Alex jump. She'd finally noticed him, but surprisingly, she didn't try to hide her tears or put on her usual angry mask. "They were the only ones who ever really loved me." Alex stood frozen, unsure what to do. This was so far outside their normal routine that he felt like he'd stepped into an alternate universe. Linda never showed vulnerability. Linda never talked about her parents, who had died in a car accident shortly before their marriage. Linda never let anyone see her cry. Everyone else. She continued, her voice thick with tears. Everyone else just saw the fat girl. The ugly one. The one they could make fun of to feel better about themselves. She picked up another photo, her hands trembling. "Mom and Dad, they made me feel normal. Protected. When they died, it's like I died too. The good parts of me anyway." Alex found himself moving closer, drawn by this unprecedented glimpse into his wife's pain. The floor creaked under his feet, and he saw Linda flinch, as if expecting judgment or ridicule. That small movement broke something in his heart. How many times had she flinched like that in her life? "The school kids were the worst," she said, almost whispering now. "They would moo when I walked down the hallway. Leave notes in my locker telling me to kill myself. Once her voice cracked, they took pictures of me changing for gym class and posted them everywhere." Alex sat down beside her, careful to move slowly, like approaching a frightened animal. Up close, he could see the rest of the photos. Linda at various ages, always with her parents, always with that same genuine smile he'd never seen in their marriage. The smile of someone who felt safe and loved. "After Mom and Dad died, I promised myself no one would ever hurt me again," she said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I decided it was better to be feared than laughed at. Better to hurt others before they could hurt me." She looked at Alex for the first time, her eyes red and swollen. "I got so good at it that I forgot how to be anything else." The silence that followed felt different from any they'd shared before. It wasn't charged with fear or anger or resentment. Instead, it felt like the quiet after a storm, when the world is washed clean and waiting for something new to begin. Alex looked at his wife, really looked at her, and saw past the anger and the bullying for the first time. He saw a scared little girl who had lost her only safe place in the world. He saw someone who had built walls so high to keep out pain that she'd trapped herself inside them. And for the first time since their wedding day, he felt something new stirring in his heart. Hope. The days following Alex's discovery of Linda with the photo albums were different. The change wasn't dramatic, more like ice melting in spring, slow but steady. Linda still had her moments of harshness, but now Alex could see them for what they really were. A scared person trying to protect herself the only way she knew how. One morning, over breakfast, Alex gathered his courage. "I think we should talk about what happened at my parents' house," he said quietly, watching Linda's face carefully. She stiffened, her fork freezing halfway to her mouth. But instead of the usual explosion, she just set the fork down and stared at her plate. "Your sister didn't deserve that," Linda said after a long moment, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw how happy she looked, talking about going back to school, and I couldn't stand it. Everyone gets second chances except me. At least, that's what I thought." She looked up at Alex, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I've been horrible to so many people, haven't I?" That conversation opened a door neither of them knew how to close. They talked for hours that day, really talked for the first time in their marriage. Linda told him about the years of bullying she'd endured in school, about how her parents had been her only refuge in a world that seemed determined to hurt her. She described the gut-wrenching pain of losing them both in a single night and how she transformed her grief into a weapon. After they died, I felt so exposed, she explained, twisting a tissue in her hands. Like everyone could see right through me to all the soft, broken parts inside. So I made myself hard, mean. I thought if I was scary enough, no one would try to hurt me again, she laughed bitterly. Instead, I just hurt myself more by pushing everyone away. Alex listened, really listened, his heart aching for the lonely child she'd been and the hurting woman she'd become. When she finished speaking, he took a deep breath. I think maybe we could use some help. Professional help. Someone who knows how to deal with this kind of pain. He expected resistance, but Linda surprised him again. Would they judge me? She asked, sounding suddenly small. I'm not exactly the kind of person people want to help. We'll find someone good, Alex promised. Someone who understands that hurt people often hurt people. He reached across the table and, for the first time in years, took her hand. She didn't pull away. Finding a therapist wasn't easy. They had to look for someone who specialized in trauma and grief counseling. The first session was the hardest. Linda nearly turned around 3 times on the way there. But Dr. Chen, a kind-faced woman with gentle eyes, knew exactly how to put Linda at ease. Pain doesn't make you a bad person, Dr. Chen told them in that first session. It makes you a hurt person, and hurt people deserve healing. Linda cried for almost the entire hour, but these weren't the quiet, hidden tears Alex had witnessed with the photo albums. These were cleansing tears, like a summer storm washing away years of built-up dust. The real breakthrough came when Dr. Chen suggested Linda write letters to people she'd hurt, not to send them, just to acknowledge the pain she'd caused. Linda spent evenings at the kitchen table, writing and crying, sometimes laughing at memories of her parents, sometimes shaking with the weight of her regret. Dear Rose, one letter began, and Alex watched as his wife poured out her heart to his sister. I was cruel to you because I saw in you something I'd lost. Hope. The courage to start over. I'm so sorry I tried to dim your light because mine had gone out. The changes were subtle at first. Linda started leaving the curtains open during the day, letting sunlight into their home. She stopped making loud comments about the neighbors. She even smiled, actually smiled, at the mail carrier one morning, nearly causing the poor man to drop his entire bag in shock. One night, Alex found her looking at old pictures of herself again, but this time she wasn't crying. I was thinking, she said slowly, maybe it's time I learned how to be the person my parents raised me to be, instead of the person fear turned me into. It wasn't all smooth sailing. Linda still had bad days when old habits surfaced, when fear made her lash out. But now there was something new in their relationship, understanding. When she snapped or snarled, Alex could see past the anger to the pain underneath. And more importantly, Linda was starting to see it too. I feel like I'm waking up, she told him one evening, as they sat together on their front porch, something they'd never done before. Like I've been having this horrible nightmare where I turned into a monster and I'm finally opening my eyes. She looked at him, her face soft in the fading light. Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I gave you every reason to. The hardest part of changing wasn't the therapy sessions or the emotional breakthroughs, it was facing the people Linda had hurt. She and Alex decided to start with his sister Rose, knowing this would be one of the most challenging conversations. They invited Rose to meet them at a quiet coffee shop on the edge of town. Alex had chosen this place carefully. It was neutral ground and quiet enough for a serious conversation, but public enough that Rose would feel safe. When she walked in, Linda's hands started shaking so badly she nearly spilled her coffee. I didn't think you'd come, Linda said softly as Rose sat down, keeping her distance and eyeing Linda warily. The tension at the table was thick enough to cut with a knife. Alex said it was important, Rose replied, her voice careful and measured. She looked different from the last time they'd seen her, stronger somehow, more confident. The divorce hadn't broken her after all, it had rebuilt her. Linda took a deep breath, just like Dr. Chen had taught her. I need to apologize, she began, her voice trembling. What I said at your birthday dinner was cruel. But it wasn't really about you, It was about me. I saw how strong you were, how brave you were being after your divorce, and it scared me, because I've never been that brave." Rose's expression softened slightly, though she remained quiet. Linda continued, pulling out a letter from her purse, one of many she'd written during therapy. "I wrote this for you. You don't have to read it now, but it explains everything. About my parents, about why I became so mean, about how sorry I am for hurting you." As Rose took the letter, their fingers brushed briefly. It was a small moment, but it felt huge, the first physical contact between them that wasn't tainted by fear or anger. That meeting with Rose became the template for other conversations. One by one, Linda began reaching out to people she'd hurt. The young barista at the coffee shop who she'd made cry. The neighbor whose gardening she'd mocked. Each conversation was difficult, each apology heartfelt, and each response different. Some people weren't ready to forgive, and Linda learned to accept that too. Their feelings are valid, Dr. Chen reminded her during a particularly tough session. Part of making amends is respecting people's right to their own healing journey. But the real test came when Alex suggested they host a neighborhood barbecue. Linda's first instinct was panic. "They all hate me," she protested. "Nobody will come." "Then we'll start small," Alex said gently. "We'll invite just a few people. Show them the real you, the person I'm getting to know now." They spent a week preparing. Linda baked cookies using her mother's old recipe, something she hadn't done since her parents died. Alex cleaned up the yard, setting up chairs and stringing lights. They left the invitations open-ended, knowing people might not come. The morning of the barbecue, Linda stood in front of her mirror, trying to calm her nerves. She'd chosen a bright yellow dress, her mother's favorite color, instead of her usual dark clothes. "I feel exposed," she admitted to Alex. "You look beautiful," he said, and for the first time in their marriage, she almost believed him. The first guest to arrive was Rose, carrying a homemade apple pie, an olive branch if ever there was one. Then came the neighbor whose garden Linda had criticized, bringing fresh vegetables from that very same garden. The young couple from across the street came with their kids, who were initially shy but soon began playing in the yard. Linda moved through her guests with a new kind of grace. She was still large, still taking up space, but now she did it differently, not as a threat, but as a presence. She listened more than she spoke, laughed genuinely at jokes, and when she did talk, her words built bridges instead of walls. The highlight of the evening came when the elderly neighbor, Mr. Wilson, pulled out his guitar. Soon everyone was singing along to old songs, their voices mixing in the warm evening air. Linda found herself crying, but for once, they were happy tears. "Your mom and dad would be proud," Alex whispered, squeezing her hand. "This is who they raised you to be." Later that night, after everyone had gone home, Linda and Alex sat on their porch swing, something that had become their new tradition. The yard was still decorated with lights, casting a soft glow over everything. "I feel lighter," Linda said, watching fireflies dance in the darkness. "Not physically, I'm still me. But inside, where it matters." She turned to Alex, her face serious. "I spent so many years being angry at the world for not accepting me that I forgot to accept myself." 1 year had passed since the day Alex found Linda crying over old photographs. The changes in their lives were both subtle and profound, like a garden that transforms not in sudden bursts, but through daily growth and care. That house, once a fortress of drawn curtains and silence, had become a different place entirely. Sunlight streamed through open windows, and the sounds of life, real life, not just TV shows turned up too loud, filled the rooms. The kitchen now smelled of fresh-baked cookies and healthy meals they cooked together, recipes learned from the cooking class they joined as part of their shared journey. Linda's transformation wasn't just emotional. With guidance from her doctors and a nutritionist, she'd started making different choices about her health. Not because anyone shamed her into it, but because she wanted to honor her parents' memory by taking care of herself. "They always wanted me to be healthy and happy," she told Alex one evening. "I think I finally understand that those two things can go together." The neighborhood had noticed the changes too. The mail carrier now stopped for friendly chats. The young couple across the street invited them to their daughter's birthday party. Even the local cafe, where Linda had once reduced a barista to tears, had become their regular Sunday morning spot. The same barista now greeted Linda with a genuine smile and knew their regular orders by heart. But the most significant change was in Linda's relationship with Rose, Alex's sister. What started with that first difficult apology had grown into something neither woman expected, a real friendship. They met for coffee every Wednesday, and Rose had become Linda's biggest supporter in her journey of self-discovery. You know what's funny? Rose said during one of their coffee dates, "I used to be so scared of you. Now I can't imagine not having you as a sister." Linda had cried right there in the coffee shop, not caring who saw her tears. The weekly therapy sessions with Dr. Chen continued, but they were different now. Instead of focusing on past trauma, they talked about future hopes. Linda had started volunteering at the local library's reading program for kids. At first, parents had been wary, but the children took to her immediately. She had a way of making the stories come alive, and her big warm presence made the kids feel safe rather than intimidated. One little girl, about 7 years old, had asked Linda why she was so big. Instead of getting defensive or angry like she would have in the past, Linda had smiled and said, "People come in all different sizes, sweetie. What matters is how big your heart is." The girl had thought about this for a moment before declaring that Linda must have the biggest heart in the world. This time, the tears that came were happy ones. Alex watched all these changes with a mixture of pride and awe. The woman he'd married out of obligation had become someone he genuinely loved and admired. Their evenings were filled with real conversations now, not fearful silence. They laughed together, dreamed together, and faced challenges together. On their wedding anniversary, they decided to renew their vows. Not with a big ceremony, but with a small gathering in their backyard. The same place where they'd hosted their first nervous barbecue. The guests included Rose, their neighbors, even Dr. Chen. Linda wore a beautiful blue dress, and this time when she walked down the makeshift aisle, there was no fear in anyone's eyes. "When we first got married," Alex said in his vows, "I was afraid. Now I'm grateful. Not because you changed who you are, but because you found the courage to be who you really were all along." Linda's vows were simpler but just as powerful. "You saw me when I was invisible behind my own walls. You waited while I learned to tear them down. You loved me until I remembered how to love myself." Later that evening, as their friends and family celebrated around them, Linda found a quiet moment to visit the small memorial she'd created for her parents in the garden. 2 rose bushes, planted in their memory, had bloomed beautifully that year. "I think I finally became the daughter you always saw in me," she whispered to the roses. "And I found someone who sees me the same way you did." As she stood there, Alex appeared beside her, slipping his hand into hers. They didn't need words anymore. Their silence was comfortable now, filled with understanding instead of fear. The evening breeze carried the sounds of laughter and conversation from their backyard, a testament to how far they'd come. Linda squeezed Alex's hand and smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached her eyes and warmed her whole face. She was still a large woman, still taking up space in the world, but now she did it with grace and confidence instead of anger and fear. She had learned that being seen wasn't the same as being judged, and that love, real love, had nothing to do with size and everything to do with the size of one's heart.